But God protected me, He preserved me. And the last time, when everyone thought that in prison you lose all your freedom, right? But in prison I found my freedom because I found Jesus. And from that day on, I renounced my gang, I came out of my gang, I came out of my old addiction, my old habits, and I was just very focused and committed to the Word. And after I was so committed to the Word, and upon my release, I went to the New Charis Mission. Instead of going back to the world out there, or even to my family, I choose to be in a place where I can continue my discipleship. Yeah, so I was trained there, and now it has been coming to 12 years. Yeah, so I'm grateful that God saved me. And right now, whenever I share His Word, or whenever I'm given a chance to lead a worship or even share His Word, right, I'm always grateful, and I always remind myself that without God, I'm nothing. Yeah, so that's a bit about myself. So next time when you all see me, that you all know that who I am. I'm from New Charis, like all this stuff. Now today I want to share with all of us about the Peacemaker. Now texts are taken from Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. Now this is a sermon, right? Many people would know and would love so much. Yeah, but more than just this Sermon on the Mount itself, but I guess there are many things that even a short verse like that, just one verse, we can learn many things, especially as like time as such. I don't know whether we realize or not, especially right now, these 2 years, last year and this year, we are living in a very tense world. And even among Christians, very tense stuff. We have very different point of view. We voice out very differently. We share very differently. And I even hear some of the church pastors having some arguments because of certain situation that's happening in the world. So I was praying, and then I remember that this Bible, right? This topic, I prepared it 6 years ago. 6 years ago, I prepared this, and then somehow or other, when I was praying, I sensed that I need to share about the Peacemaker. I went back, I revisited this because I was supposed to share about the significance. Yeah, I remember a few weeks ago I sent this the significance. But more than that, I think after I prayed, I think that I want to share this Peacemaker with everyone. I think it is very important and relevant, especially for season as such. So a bit about the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5. Now Matthew chapter 5 to 7, right, is called the Sermon on the Mount, and especially when come to chapter 5, it started with the 8 Beatitudes. Now this was what Jesus was sharing or teaching the disciples, the 8 attitudes that we should have. But what is actually the 8 Beatitude? What actually the word Beatitude really means is this. The word Beatitude actually tells us is called supreme blessedness. Okay, supreme blessedness. So if we can have this 8 attitude, we are like having this supreme blessedness. But more than just that, I thought I want to share with all of us in this Matthew chapter 5 verse 9, in this just one verse, it says, "Blessed are the peacemaker, for they will be called sons of God or children of God," it depends on the translation. Okay, it says, "Blessed are the peacemaker, for they will be called sons of God." Now, the Sermon on the Mount, the 8 Beatitudes, the first 4 Beatitudes, right, actually focuses a lot on our relationship with God, and then maybe the next 4 focuses on our relationship with men. Okay, and that is why when you move to chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5 to 7, right? So when you move to chapter 6, it first tells us about our relationship with God. You look at the whole chapter, it tells us about our relationship with God. And then when you move on to chapter 7, it tells us about our relationship with men. So it continues about the 8 Beatitudes. But one thing that I realized that we shouldn't be missing is this. Now, this was something that Jesus wanted us to have at the beginning of his ministry. Now, even though this wasn't really the first sermon that he preached, because in Matthew chapter 4, you see that he started preaching already about repentance. But when it comes to Matthew chapter 5, right, it is a sermon for all the disciples, especially the disciples, to have that kind of attitude for us to live in this world. And then after that, right, this was something that Jesus began with during his ministry. But let us not also forget how Jesus ended. Now, before Jesus went to that cross, right, if you look at the four Gospels, the only Gospel that recorded in John chapter 14 to 17 onwards, the only Gospel, because all the Gospel, if you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right, after Jesus washes the disciples' feet, and then the Last Supper, and then it was the Garden of Gethsemane. But only John, the book of John, if you read chapter 14, after the washing of feet and then the Lord's Supper, but then it didn't end there. The story continues because Jesus, after that, he continued teaching the disciples, if you read. Now that is the only gospel that did not lead us straight to the Garden of Gethsemane. It leads us to the teaching of Jesus, and this was how Jesus re-emphasized actually the 8 Beatitudes from chapter 14 to 17, if you all were to read it. From John chapter 14 to 17, now John was the only person who recorded this, and let us not miss it. There must be something that John wants us to learn. And John, we know that he is the dearest disciple, so to speak. But to me, right, I think there's something that John wants us to learn. So it is like chapter 14 to 17, it is like the last words of Jesus before he went to that cross. Not before the resurrection, not before the ascension. No. I'm saying before he went to the cross. Now chapter 14 to 17, when we have time, right, actually we can go back and revisit all this. Chapter 14 and then chapter 15, this was when Jesus told about, I am the vine, you are the branches. And then chapter 16, he says the promise of the Holy Spirit. Chapter 17, how we should live one another as disciples of Christ. And then Jesus also prayed for the disciples, and he prayed for him. He prayed for himself, and he prayed for the disciples before he went on to the cross. A lot of details before the Garden of Gethsemane. So I could see something that we can be learning from. That's why when we go to the Sermon on the Mount right now, chapter 5, now after shortly Jesus began his ministry, he shared about the 8 Beatitudes. And before he went to the cross, again he re-emphasized, but he took a different form to remind us of the 8 Beatitudes. Now right now, today, I'm going to share with us the 7th Beatitude that is stated here, called, Blessed are the Peacemakers. I personally was very ministered by it, because actually before I prepared this sermon 6 years ago, I always have the wrong understanding about peacemaker. Now when it comes to peacemaker, I believe that every one of us, we think about conflict resolution. Now peacemaker is more than just a mediator. Because before I prepared this, right, all the while I thought when Jesus was mentioning about peacemaker, like it's like how we resolve conflicts, but it is more than that. Let us not shortchange this verse that Jesus is teaching us right now. Yeah, he says that blessed are the peacemaker. Now peacemaker in its original text, I hope I pronounced it correctly. I went to check a few pronunciation. Okay, it's called Irenopoies. Okay. Peacemaker, Irenopoies. Okay, what does it mean later on? I will share with all of us. Irenopoies, for they will be called the sons of God or the children of God. Now, before we talk about peacemaker, we need to understand what is the peace that Jesus is talking about when he was teaching about we should be peacemaker, or blessed are the peacemaker. Now, the word peace, right, actually it was mentioned a few times in the Bible, especially in the book of John chapter 14 onwards. That's why I say, right, Jesus re-emphasized, using John to re-emphasize on the 8 Beatitudes. Now, John chapter 14 verse 27, I think a lot of us will know this verse. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. And then shortly after, John chapter 16, Again, before he prayed for himself and he prayed for the disciples, he ended off with this in chapter 16. He says this, I have told you this thing. Now, what are the things that he told the disciples? We have to revisit chapter 14 onwards. Then you will know what Jesus told them. Chapter 14 to 16 to 33. We will be able to find out what Jesus was telling them and why he need to give us this peace and how this peace is given to us. Okay, that's why he says, John chapter 16 verse 33, he says, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. And in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Now, this peace that Jesus gave us is a very powerful weapon. Now, this peace, actually, the original word, in the Old Testament, right, they use the word shalom. Shalom, okay? Now, it also means like prosperity, all this. But in the New Testament, it no longer uses the word shalom. Now, when Jesus was saying that this peace he has given to man, this peace he has given to us, he said this peace as irane. Irane, okay, irane. Now we have to not shalom, irane. Now irane actually gives us the idea or the meaning of quietness, stillness, and calmness. Now Jesus says that he gives us this peace. This peace comes with quietness, stillness, and calmness. Now quietness talk about sober-minded. That means we do not allow a lot of voices to crowd in our mind, not the noises that we are entertaining, but there is a sober-mindedness in us. And then stillness talk about the patience, and stillness also talk about the rest that we can have in all situations. Now last but not least, they talk about calmness. Calmness talk about the focus that we can have in time of chaos. And it also tells us that we will not panic or be anxious. Now that is calmness. So the peace that Jesus gave to us, irane, he tells us that he has given us the quietness, the stillness, and the calmness. Now when it comes to the Sermon on the Mount, right after Jesus shared with the disciples about Sermon on the Mount, chapter 6, it shows them how to live out the beatitude between people and God. And then chapter 7 talks about people and people. And after that, if you can see and you can check, Jesus was always living out by examples what he has taught the disciples. And that is why the disciples has a very clear picture about the 8 beatitudes. Because after Jesus taught the disciples, he kept on living this up. And after, when it comes to chapter 14 onwards, he knows that he is going to leave the disciples. And this time round, he needs to emphasize about this, the peace. Remember, no matter what happened. So that's why it's more than just conflict resolution. Because the peace that Jesus is giving them, wanting them to be the peacemaker, is not about the conflict resolution only. It talks about the situation they are about to embark, the journey they are about to embark into when Jesus ascended to heaven. And Jesus knows that in time to come, mankind, we will be living in a time of chaos. And that is why you need to tell us that actually no matter what situation that we are in, maybe storm, a chaotic moment or whatsoever, we can have this peace. And not only we have this peace, we are supposed to be peacemaker. That is how it comes about. If you revisit the 8 beatitudes. That means in all situations, we are supposed to live out these 8 beatitudes. That means these 8 attitudes out. To tell people that we are his disciple, we have been taught by him, and we have this peace enough, we can leave all this out. So right now, I just want to share a few things about the peacemaker so that we can have a better understanding. Now, peacemaker, when Jesus talked about the peacemaker, he is not talking about a peace hoper. We don't just hope for peace, because we know that we have peace. When peacemaker, this word, right, just now I share all of us, it actually means to accomplish, to execute. The word maker.
We are supposed to execute or to accomplish the peace that Jesus has given to us, the peace that Jesus was talking to.